Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing a review of The Empire of the Damned by Jay Kristoff. This is the second book in the Empire of the Vampire trilogy. I don't actually know if the series has a name, but this without a doubt has been my most anticipated read of 2024. Now, I will be doing a short non-spoiler review, which is going to be this video, and then straight after I finish filming this video, I'm going to film a completely spoiler-filled review for those who want to dig a bit deeper. I made a ton of notes on my iPad, and I also tabbed my physical book quite a lot. So I have a lot to say and I have a lot of thoughts about this book. I wish I'd kind of done the same thing with book one, but at that point I wasn't really doing really detailed reviews, but I definitely think this book warrants it, especially because I think my experience was not the same experience as a lot of people. So one thing before I jump into my review is this book does start 1 week, I believe. I think it's a couple of days to 1 week after the events of book one, which I really like. Not much time has passed. We're jumping straight back in. I was a little bit worried because I had not done a reread of book one prior to reading this book, but Kristoff does a really good job of reminding you of the key events without it feeling like you're being dumped with loads of information. So kudos to him for being able to do that. There's also a nice little bit at the beginning of the book where we get some reminders of the key characters, and I really valued that because it helped me kind of picture who was who and where everybody was in their journey. So with that in mind, I'm now going to kick off my review. This is not going to be that long because again, I'm going to reserve a lot of my really key thoughts in the spoiler-filled one. Let's start with what I did like. Kristoff, without a doubt, is a very talented writer. He's very good at writing complex characters and he's good at writing plot. I've always talked about how I'm a very character-driven reader, and I definitely think these books are very character-driven. I do have an issue with this that I will come on to later on, but his writing really is exquisite. I think he does a really good job of getting what needs to get through without it being overly flowery, overly pedantic. It gets the job done, and I find it so easy to read his writing. I find it to be very accessible, which I always appreciate. This brings me on to the next thing that I really liked, which are the characters. I mentioned how he writes very complex characters, and I think he really does do that. Yes, sometimes they can be a little bit cheesy, and yes, sometimes they can say some very cheesy things, but I think the characters, their motivations, who they are, what they're doing, and why they're doing it is very clear, and it's phenomenal how many authors don't do that, and he does it to perfection, and I know where I stand with each of these characters. Gabrielle, still to this day, one of my favourite characters. I adore Gabrielle. Yes, he can be very cheesy sometimes, but I love it. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of eat it up, and I loved being in his head, and I loved how we're seeing him develop from book one, and we're seeing his journey and how he's ended up where he's ended up because this story is being told retrospectively. I also continue to really like Dior. They are a really great character, very witty, very cutting, but again, another character that is really developing into their own, and I really respect the way that Kristoff has developed Dior as in particular because of where she starts and where she's kind of at the point in this book. I am very nervous about where her character is going to go though, so I'm not sure if I'm going to say the same thing in the third book, but at least for this book, for the majority of the book, I really loved the direction of where this character was going. There are a bunch of other really great characters. I'm going to leave those for my spoiler-filled review just because they will be spoilers, and I just going to assume that anybody who's watching this review has not read the first book and is just purely curious whether this book is a good middle book. Then I'm going to move on to world building. The world building is great. Again, I think this kind of goes back to Kristoff's writing. I think he's very good at building characters and building worlds. He's just really good at it. We get a good sense of where we are. We get a good sense of the landscapes. We get a good sense of when the characters are in like little cities or towns, they feel really enriched. You get a sense of the smells, the foods, you get a sense of the clothes. You really get like a rich sense of this medieval inspired fantasy novel. That's one of my favorite I love medieval inspired fantasy. Like it's one of my favorite things to read, and he does an incredible job of capturing that. A lot of the lore, I don't know if you can call it lore, but a lot of the world building is very French inspired, and that's not really something that I've read tons of in fantasy. I think there's maybe only one that I can think of that comes to mind, but I like it. I really like it, and I think he does justice to it, and I think it's very compelling to read. This brings me on to the last thing that I really liked, and that was the dialogue. I think he writes very witty dialogue. Yes, again, sometimes it can be very cheesy. But overall, as a whole, I do really enjoy it. I think it's very like sarcastic, which is my kind of dialogue. I'm quite a sarcastic person myself, and I do enjoy reading that in my books. It's why Joe Abercrombie and KJ Parker are my favourite authors. And when it's done well, it's just an absolute dream to read, and I really enjoyed it. Last thing I will mention, I forgot one other thing that I mentioned, is the thematic work continues to develop really nicely. There's a lot of discussion around kind of religion and organised religion and the downsides of religion as well. Again, I'll talk more about this in my spoiler-filled review, but there's a lot of discussion around that, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy discussion around religion and its role, and especially when that's contrasted with the role of like magic in a society, and we get a lot of exploration around that in this book, which I really liked. And then there's also the more kind of intimate personal themes that we explore, which is around kind of family, revenge, justice, love, friendship, found family, like all the things that I really love in my fantasy books. Now that brings me onto what I didn't like. There were quite a few things that I didn't like. This book, in contrast to book one, is a dual POV. And the risk of doing a dual POV book is that one of the POVs is not interesting. And that's exactly what happened in this book. Thankfully, it's not the majority of the book, but it's enough of the book that it really impacted my reading of the book. I was still able to get through them fairly quickly, but the second perspective that we follow is just not interesting enough. Gabe is a very interesting character, and like I said, you've built that time with him now that you want to just follow this guy because he's just very witty but very cutting at the same time, which I love. The second POV that we follow, just not it. I was bored. I didn't find it interesting enough, and I was just dying to read Gabe's perspective much more. Now onto the second thing that I didn't like. Not much happens in this book, and it was very upsetting to me that this is like a 650, 700 page book and not much happens. You know, I loved being back in this world for the first couple hundred pages, and then I realised there's not actually anything happening. It's your classic middle book syndrome, but I think I would be very surprised if this is actually a trilogy, because there's no way that Christoph can tie off all the loose ends in one more book. This has to be at least like a quartet or even like a quintet. And I'm here for that. I'm definitely going to read them unless it really falls off a cliff. But it really suffers from middle book syndrome. We don't really learn anything new. I think 5% of the new information that we learn is actually needed. It's mostly filler, and I just don't like it. I don't like it. And then added to the fact that you're following a second POV that I don't really care about, not a great start, to be completely honest. I think with this sort of book, I'm okay with filler books, but just make it a lot shorter, make it something where there's a bit of a side quest. And yes, we did have a bit of a side quest, but it felt largely pointless. There was no real point to it. I feel like there was a lot of added drama that didn't need to be added. It didn't really add to the overall story, and that frustrated me quite a bit. The last thing that I really did not like about it is the fact that it felt very predictable, and it relied on a lot of tropes that have been overdone in fantasy. I'm not going to mention which tropes because they will spoil the book, but there is a lot of stuff tactically that Christoph did in this book that I just did not enjoy. Again, I will talk about this more in my spoiler-filled review. The first book, I read it, and while, yes, it wasn't the most, like, new fantasy book, I felt surprised, and I felt like I was reading something that was a fresh take. This one just felt like any other cookie-cutter fantasy series that I've already read before, and that was super disappointing because that's not what the first book felt like. So I didn't find this book to really give me anything. Like I said, I found the first, like, 200-300 pages, maybe not 300, like first 200 pages really enjoyable just because I was so happy to be back in this world. But then once I got past that point, I kept thinking to myself, okay, when is the smoking gun going to happen? When is something interesting going to happen? When am I going to learn something that's going to completely change my world? And that never happened, unfortunately, until like right at the end. And even then, it just felt like a cheap tactic to get me to read the next book. So overall, I was very, very lukewarm. I wanted to love this book, and I wish I could have rated this book higher. I would love to give this book like a 4 or 5 stars, but I would be dishonest to myself if I did that. And to be honest with you, this book is currently sitting around about a 3 stars, maybe even a 2.75, which is very bang average, right? A 2.5 is average. I would say it's maybe slightly, tiny little bit over average. And honestly, it hurts my soul to say that. What I'm really hoping is that book 3 really picks up and we really start that with a bang, given what happens at the end of this book. But I don't know. I just really hope this doesn't drag on, and I really hope Christoph does what he needs to do to get these characters to a good place again, because I feel like a lot of the character journeys as well are going in directions that I'm not particularly excited about. So there we have it. That's my very quick review of this book. I know a lot of people really love this book, and I definitely think I'm in the minority. As I said, for the third time, I loved being back in this world, but at the end of the day, the book still has to have a point, and it just didn't really feel like it did for the majority of it. Let me know down below if you have read this book. Like I said, keep an eye out for my spoiler-filled review, which I'm about to film right now. It will probably come out a few days after this one, maybe even like a week after, depending on how long it takes me to edit, depending on how long the video is. But regardless, I'll see you down in the comments, and I hope to see you in my spoiler-filled review if you have read it. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe as always, take care, and I will see you soon. Bye.